What's up, guys? Thanks for tuning in and welcome to today's lesson. You're probably here because you're feeling some sort of frustration in your guitar playing. Mainly in the left hand is what we're going to cover today, but you're probably feeling like you're stuck in boxes mainly, like you can't get free of one position, and when you try to move across the fretboard, you start running into problems. And you might also feel like maybe your left hand technique isn't quite all there, and that might be limiting you as well. So today, my goal with this video is to get you in a better place in those areas. I want to help you improve your left hand technique so you're not getting caught up on your fingers or your hand or feeling pain and tension, those sorts of things. And I also want to get you more comfortable with moving freely across the fretboard. So go ahead and grab your guitar, tune up, and let's jump down and look at this lesson. Alright guys, we're going to start off here with some technique, and reason being is because we want to be able to effectively and efficiently play the guitar without hurting or injuring ourselves, and we want to be able to effectively communicate the messages from our brain to our hands in a coherent and easy way on the guitar. All the information I'm about to give you is quite a bit, and that being said, I know it can be a lot to retain, so I made a free PDF file. It's just a left-hand checklist for you. You can go ahead and download that. It's absolutely free, and you can use that to follow along with this video. Or you could just keep it for your own keepsake and use it in your own daily practice routine. So go ahead and visit the description of the video and download that PDF file. So the first point of our technique we're going to focus on here is relaxing, which is super important. We want to make sure that the signals that our brain is trying to send to our hands gets effectively communicated. If we're not relaxing, that's not going to happen. So the things we want to focus on here is make sure we're sitting up straight with good posture to start. And then as we're going through our basic motions and moving across the fretboard and fretting here, we want to make sure that our shoulder and our arms and our back are staying nice and relaxed. You want to also make sure that you're breathing naturally. Breathing is huge. If you're not breathing, it's going to cause you to tense up, and that's going to run you into a lot of problems. The next part of our technique we're going to focus on here is proper left hand placement and position. So we're going to go ahead and take our left hand, and we're just going to make a nice, comfortable U shape just like that. You can see this nice U shape right here. Don't tense up. We don't want to be tense. Just a nice, relaxed U shape just like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to put that right under the guitar. The neck is going to fit right in that U assembly with some space between the fingers here. We don't want the guitar sitting directly on the hand by any means. We just want some nice comfortable space there. We want room for that first finger to reach, and the rest of the fingers should follow suit. We also want to make sure that our thumb is always parallel to that middle finger as we move across the fretboard and fret here. A couple other things to note here is we want to make sure that this thumb joint is always relaxed. A common tendency we have as guitar players is to be tense with that thumb joint and kind of squeeze on it. We want to make sure that's nice and relaxed. So kind of keep that in mind, as well as the inside of the palm here. We want to make sure that's not tensing up as well. So again, nice comfortable U shape. The thumb is nice and relaxed. We got space between the fingers and the strings. And keep that inside of that palm relaxed. And the last part of technique we're going to talk about here is obviously fretting. And there's a couple things we want to think about here. And one is we want to make sure that we're obviously not fretting too hard, right? We want to make sure we're not pushing the strings with a ton of might as we're going through these here. You really only need to push the strings as much as it takes to get a note to sound. So a good way you can work on this is to actually just take one note and mute it. So we're not actually pushing the string down. We're just lightly laying our finger on the string to get this sort of muted sound. And as we do that, we want to kind of gradually apply pressure here until that note sounds. And that's going to tell you exactly how much pressure you need to get the note to sound. And you want to figure that out with each finger. A couple other things we want to think about here is when we fret, we want to make sure that our fingers are reaching to each note. There's going to be a little bit of wrist movement going on here, but for the most part, you want to make sure the fingers are doing the work here. That's going to give you the most efficiency. And same thing applies for when we're fretting the notes. Obviously, we don't want to push too hard there. Same thing goes for when we're pulling off, when we're using legato. We want to make sure we're not pulling the hell out of the strings here. We just want to pull just enough to get a note to sound, right? And in that regard, with our pull-offs, we want to make sure that we're pulling down towards our palm. Some people like to think of pulling down towards the floor, but in my opinion, that kind of makes you pull off too hard. So I like this idea of pulling off towards your palm. That gives you just the right amount of pressure needed to get those notes to sound. We also want to make sure that we're not squeezing with the thumb. You don't want to squeeze the neck with the back of the thumb like that, because that's going to create tension and slow you down. You could also hurt yourself that way. So again, make sure we're not squeezing, we're not pressing very hard. And the other thing you really want to note here is as you're fretting scales and notes, you want to make sure that your notes are long, smooth, and connected. You don't want any space between the notes, because it kind of makes the sound interrupted and it's not going to sound as musical or beautiful. So as we go through this, we want to make sure there's no space between the notes here. So what you're going to have to do in that regard is really let your ears guide you, really listen to make sure there's no space, and also feel the vibration of the string under each finger. And that should get you a lot closer to the results you're looking for. So let's go ahead and jump into this scales and fretboard freedom practice. Alright guys, so we're going to start off with a pretty familiar shape here. We're just going to take an A major scale and 3-note per string style here, starting in A major, so that'll be our 5th fret of the E string. And we know we've got frets 5, 7, and 9 here. 5, 7, 9 on the A, 6, 7, 9 on the D, 6, 7, 9 on the G, and this will be 7, 9, 10 on the B, and 7, 9, and 10 on the E. So the idea we're going to do is we want to move that shape all around the neck. The goal here is we want to get out of that box position. So the way we do that is we actually just break this into what's known as the diatonic modes. And all the diatonic modes are scales that start on each individual note within the key. So if we just stay in that position, we can figure out what those notes are. So let's go ahead and just take one octave of each of those. So let's again start on our root, which is A, and we're just going to play to the next A. Alright, so let's start on our next note, which is B, and we're just going to go to the next B. Same thing for E. I'm sorry, that would be C sharp. I needn't go on. So the idea here is we're going to take each of those scale shapes and we're going to move them across the neck. So how do we do that? My idea with this is I take groupings of 2 strings at a time, 3-note per string scales, and we're going to consecutively move those across the neck. So if we start with our A, two string groupings again. We're not playing the whole scale here. We're only playing the notes that happen on those 2 strings. So we've got 5, 7, 9, 5, 7, 9, and back down. So remember we figured out that B in that position, right? The second mode. But we're not going to play it there. We're going to play it in the next spot that it happens on that grouping of 2 strings on the E string. Now let's move to our third mode. So now you can already see that we're starting to get our blueprint for how the scale sounds and looks moving across the neck. Again, so let's start on our first mode. Second mode. Third mode. Now let's go to our fourth mode. So that's kind of the framework for this idea that we're going to be working with here. Remember, 3-note per string scales, groupings of 2 strings at a time. So the beauty with this is now we've already kind of discovered we're moving across the neck, but now we've got 4 other strings to account for. So the obvious logic here would be to just do the same thing, right? Take those 2 string groupings and apply them in different string groups, right? So if we have, so let's just continue that scale there. So now we're working with the A and the D strings. So if we keep working in that fashion, we know that note is our 4th degree, or the 4th mode, right? Now let's move backwards to, there's our 3rd. There's 2. And then here's our root, which will be open, or our 1st position. So what is it that we actually do with that information is the question. So I like to think of this in a couple different steps. The first step is you want to kind of figure those string groupings and notes out. So what you can do is you can either start with that logic of playing that scale to start, in that one position. That way you know where each note is located and how that scale sounds. But doing it that way to start, you'll get the sound in your ear, and that will give you a much easier time letting your ear guide you across the neck to figure this out in a horizontal fashion, right? So that would be step 1. Just figure those notes out. Start on just 1 string grouping at a time and just let your ear guide you through it, keeping that major sound in your ear. And by doing it that way, we just covered that entire string grouping across the entire neck. So then the next thing would be to take the next string grouping. So let's take our A and D strings. Remember, we're trying to remember this key of A. We kind of always want to have that root in our head. No matter what key you're doing this in, always have the root in your head. But in this case, which is A, there's our root, so let's find the next mode on that next string grouping, right? So here's our 4th mode. That's the first note that occurs in that string grouping. And then from there, we just continue the A major scale. And again, use your ears to guide you horizontally through each position. Same thing goes for each of our different string groupings. So the first string groupings we did were the E and A strings. The next grouping we did was A and D. Next string grouping would be D and G. And then the next string grouping, would be B, G, and B. And then the last string grouping will be our last 2 strings, B and E, right? So step 1, use your ears to figure out how those sound and how they look moving across the fretboard. And let's move on to step number 2. All right, so step number 2 is where we're going to apply this to a metronome and actually work on this in a musical kind of way. So you can do this in a couple different ways. You can choose whichever technique you would like to use. For me, I like to focus on a couple different things. I'll do this legato, which is all hammer-ons and pull-offs if you choose. That would just be picking the first note that happens on each string. And I combine that with hybrid picking, so I would do like a down pick with my pick, and then on the next string I would actually pluck it with my middle finger. So one way to do it again would be that legato and the hybrid picking. I would also suggest don't neglect your alternate picking, which is another good way to practice this. So yeah, like I said, whichever techniques you like to play with when you're actually just playing guitar, I would use those techniques to practice this concept. That way, when you go to apply this concept to your own playing, it's not foreign. Your hands kind of already know how to do it, and you're just strengthening the things that you already like to use. Make sense? So what we're going to do now is we're going to apply this to the metronome. So I'm going to go ahead and throw on my metronome here. You can use whatever metronome marking you're comfortable at. Obviously, if you're struggling at whatever tempo you have it on, then back off a little bit. So if you're at 100 beats per minute and you're having trouble with that, back it off to 90 and so on. So here's my metronome. It might be a little bit hard to hear here because I don't have the metronome hooked into my DAW, but for purposes here, I think you get the idea. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on rhythm. And the most important thing here is we want to try to avoid this thinking of how many notes per string we're playing. That is a good idea at first because we want to be able to locate the notes. We know we've got 3 notes here and 3 notes here. But musically, that's not going to do us any good. So now we have to think about this in terms of rhythm. So I'm going to throw a metronome back on here. And as we play through this, I want you guys to focus on eighth notes, triplets, and 16th notes, and if you're feeling ambitious, 16th triplets. So I'm going to show you how that looks here. So here's my metronome. Let's start with eighth notes, and we want to really make sure we're thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, right? We don't want to think 3 notes here, 3 notes here. We want 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3. This is really, really going to solidify your rhythmic awareness, and it's going to make your playing much more clean. So again, eighth notes. Triplets, right? And then last but not least, 16th notes. So those are the 3 rhythms we're going to pay attention to here. So whichever rhythm you decide to choose, stick with that, and let's make sure we get it down first. So then the next part of this is we're going to apply that moving horizontally. So this is where it gets a little tricky. You really, really want to make sure that you're paying attention to those position changes as we go through each of those. You want to make sure that they're really in time. So let's go ahead and do this again with eighth notes, and then focus on those position changes. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and... So that is the idea there. Same thing goes for triplets, right? So that is the idea there. And let's hit the 16th notes real quick too, so you can see how that sounds and looks as well. Right? 16ths would be 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a... And then the next step here is going to be, once you get comfortable going through each of those subdivisions by themselves, that is, you're going to want to try to cycle through these, and this is kind of where the magic really happens. So what I mean by cycle is you're going to keep the metronome on, and instead of just doing eighth notes, then stopping, then doing triplets, then stopping, and then doing 16th notes and stopping, you're actually just going to start doing a combination of these. And it doesn't really matter too much which combinations you choose, as long as you're hitting each subdivision on its own without stopping the metronome. So this is really going to make your rhythmic awareness much finer tuned. So I'm going to show you how that looks as well. So I'm going to start with eighth notes, and then I'll go triplets, and then I'll go 16th notes. So here's our metronome. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And that is the idea there. A couple things to note here is when you are going through these, you want to make sure that obviously you're not just doing the lowest string grouping of the E and A strings like we just demonstrated here. Obviously that was just for video purposes. When you practice this on your own, make sure you're hitting each different string grouping, because you want to be familiar with moving in this horizontal fashion across the entire fretboard and all 6 strings, okay? So make sure you're hitting every single string grouping, not just the lowest one. Another thing to note here is when you are going through this, you want to make sure that your notes are very long and smooth and connected, like we spoke about in our technique portion of this video, right? So we don't want any space between the notes. We want them right next to each other. Right, so that's how it should sound. This is how it should not sound. I over-exaggerated a little bit there, but point being, you don't want any of that space going on, because you want to be able to control that string noise as much as possible, but also it just sounds much more musical if you give each note its full value. So that being said, full value for the notes is super important as well. So if we throw our metronome on here, we want to make sure that we aren't putting any rests or space in between those notes. I know it sounds a little redundant because we've been saying it a lot, but we want to make sure that we're giving each note its full value. So an eighth note, 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, right? We don't want any of this going on, because in that case we are not giving the notes their full duration. We want to make sure they're getting their full value. It sounds much clearer, much cleaner, and much more musical, okay? So make sure we're paying attention to that. In that regard, something that's going to get a little tricky is string changes. String changes are super important here, so you got to be careful of those. It's a common problem amongst a lot of guitar players when they're working on this sort of thing, because our tendency when we switch strings is when we get to this string switch, we end up having space there because it's a hard stretch for one, and our brain is occupied with the idea of we have to switch to a new string. So we're not focused so much on keeping those notes long, smooth, and connected. So really, really pay attention to those string changes. I'll over-exaggerate a little bit here so you can see it. So here's our low E string. And it's going to get a little tricky when you go down, when you descend within your scale. So again, really pay attention to those string changes, okay? And then the last thing to note here is once you kind of have all those things down, once you're feeling really comfortable going through your different subdivisions, cycling the subdivisions, when you have made sure that all your notes are long, smooth, and connected, once you're getting through the entire neck and the fretboard and all of your string groupings, pretty much without having to think about it too much, and it's really comfortable, then you can start bumping up the metronome and trying to increase your speed. So if, for example, where we were at with 90 beats per minute, if that is starting to feel easy for you, bump it up to 100. Once that becomes really easy, bump it up to 110, and so on until you increase the speed. So that should get you feeling a lot more comfortable in this area. All right, guys, so that is it for this video. A couple more things to think about here, just some end of practice notes, if you will. Make sure that you guys are just being really patient with this. It's going to be really frustrating at first, but it takes a really long time to really get this down. So don't feel like you have to rush through this process. The more you take your time with it and do it correctly, the better results you're going to get. So if you're feeling frustrated and you're feeling like you're not making much progress, it's probably just because you haven't put in enough hours on it. You haven't put in the repetitions. So it's a thing. It's really frustrating, and I myself have been there. There's times where I feel like I've got it down, and then the next day I pick the guitar up and I can't do the things that I've been practicing. So in that sense, it's just a matter of repetitions. You just have to do it 1,000 times. So if you're feeling like you're not quite getting it, just put more reps in and take your time. If it's feeling difficult, just slow down a little bit, back off the metronome, and really make sure your mechanics are working right, and really focus on making sure you're getting a good sound out of the guitar, okay? But other than that, that's all I got for you guys. Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for sticking around for all of it. And if you guys found it helpful, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.